of our looking together, wake-up call. Oh, did everybody get an outline? If you didn't get an outline, hold your hand up high so the guys can see that. Thank you very much. Wake-up call. So far, we've talked about the shortness or brevity of life that God has given us. As James tells us, life is just a mist that appears for a little time and then it vanishes away. And we remember I had the little can of air freshener I was spraying around, and we watched how quickly after I sprayed that product out that it cleared. And so I kept pushing that until we were all choking on it. But you get the idea that we're just here for a little bit, and why invest our life, everything that we are, everything we're going to be, into something that's here today and gone tomorrow? Let's invest into something that will last beyond the envelope of death. And of course, that's only going to happen if you and I put our faith in Jesus Christ. Amen? I mean, that's what this is about. That's why we're here today. As I mentioned last Friday night at a program, Pray for America, I said it's not a time to talk church. It's not time to think church. It's not time to just play church. It's time to be the church. And one of the things we want to do as a church here in this community is to stand as a beacon of light, reflecting Jesus, the true light that's come into this world. And so what we're doing with our life makes a difference. It matters. Your life matters. Look at your neighbor and say, you matter. Yeah, it's okay to point. You matter, okay? You matter. And so we were talking about what are we doing with ourselves? When we're getting up in the morning, we go through the mundane routine things, and you see all these things that we've got on our schedules, and life can get busy. How many of you think at one time or another, if not presently, you've had too many irons in the fire? Anybody? Yeah. We need to prioritize those things and get that in the framework of where we're always putting God first instead of throwing God the leftovers. You know, I want to be a better Christian. I want to pray more. I know, preacher, I need to study the Bible more. I need to read it more. I need to spend time doing something in service to this community and loving my neighbor. And I'll do that as soon as I find the time. We were at a men's retreat yesterday, Momentum, down at Southwest Church of Christ. Jimmy Hyatt and Jacob and I were able to go and hear some great speakers, and the theme was about putting Jesus first in your relationships, in church, in your life. They even used the text that we've been looking at starting in week 2 of this series, where we were looking at love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. As a matter of fact, go ahead and open up your Bibles there to Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, beginning in verse 30. And that was an encouraging time for us guys to get together and talked about what that meant to put God first. And one of the things that was in a discussion group that I was participating in that was brought up was that you're going to learn where your priorities are if you follow your money and your time. And of the two things I just mentioned, time is the most precious one of those commodities. That's the leveling ground, is it not? How many hours in the day do you have? Okay, I know some of you think this is a trick question. It's simple. It's not a trick question. Wyatt, how many hours are in the day? How many are in the hours a day for you, Jerry? 24. In the back. Paul, how many do you have? Not 23. Not 25. Everybody's got the same amount. Now, when you're talking about money, okay, you know, Paul has more money than I do. Wyatt has none. Get a job, right? Mowing season's coming up, brother. But the hours, the time, that's the precious commodity. And we can't get any more of it. We can't buy it. We can't sell it, really. And here's another thing. You're never going to find it. How many of you have said, I'll do that when I find the time? And how many of you found it? You know, you don't just look at a clock on the wall and say, oh, there it is. There it is, right back there. I like the story of the guy who died and gone to heaven. I've got a lot of these stories, by the way. But this one is, he walked into this room and he saw all these clocks on the wall. And when Peter entered into the room, it was kind of the waiting room for, there's always this, St. Peter's there at the gate, right? This is a waiting room. Peter came in and said, "Are you ready to go into heaven? I'm ready to take you there." He says, "Well, before I go," the guy says, "I just got a question about all these clocks because I've noticed one thing or two. Some of them big, some of them are different, some of them small, but they're all off. None of them are matched, and they're not even on the hour together. Like, it's not giving you Chicago time and New York time and California time. It's various things. And some of them are moving fast over here, and some are slow, and some are really slow." And what Peter said was, "Well, you see, this is the room that represents all the people in their lives and how they spent their life. Every bad thought, every bad word, everything that they did that was wrong is the speed of that clock every second. And some of them were sinning more often and some not sinning as much. And so these are clocks that represent the people." And the guy says, "Well, is there a clock for me? Where's my clock?" And Peter chuckled and said, "Oh, we keep that in the office for the fan." Did you get that, Isaac? Neither did about 8 other people over here. And we've got to invest ourselves in putting Jesus first. Amen? I just asked you to invite 3 people. And you probably thought, I don't know when I'm going to have time for that. I'll come. I think that'll be neat to watch the kids. But I'm asking you, put Jesus first in your schedule this week. To intentionally go to the person. We sing the song, don't we, Gail? Sometimes, "Lead me to some soul today." I think it's a song hymn that's in our book. How are we going to be able to sing, "Lead me to some soul today," if we're not looking for a soul to be led to? Or looking for the person that needs Jesus? That's a part of putting Jesus first. You'll notice on your outline, of course, that I have the title of today's lesson, but that's also one of the questions that you're going to have to fill in the blank. So here we go. We're going to start right here. When we started off with the first command, when Jesus is asked a question, I'm just reminding you again, Jesus' approach, which is the greatest command? And Jesus, without hesitation, does not do what he usually routinely does, and that is think of a story to tell or ask a question back. He answers this question right on the spot. And he says this, "Love the Lord your God." Let's read it together. Let's vocalize this together. "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength." And we talked about that in week 2. Those many facets of love and how those represented different things. Even last week we talked about those 4 components and what that meant and how deep that love is. And then we looked at this next verse. Let's read this one together. "The second is this, love your neighbor as yourself." One of the speakers yesterday that was talking about a story he brought up on this particular passage, I believe it was the one in Matthew 22, the parallel account to this, said the Sunday school class teacher had asked the kids to read that passage together, just like we did. And then the teacher asked the students, "What is the greatest commandment that you see?" After reading this, what is the greatest commandment? And none of the kids that went to church there actually could say, and they didn't say a thing. They didn't give the answer. But a visiting boy that didn't belong to the church but come for the very first time said, "I know what it is." She said, "Okay, what is it?" "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." And everybody was so proud, and the teacher was proud. This kid that was the visitor would give the right answer. And so then she asked, "Well, which is the second command?" And nobody spoke. But here's that visitor kid. He says, "I know what it is. I know what it is." And she was in anticipation, knowing this was going to make her very proud to know that this visiting kid has got this lesson. She said, "Okay, tell us, what's the second command?" And he said, "To like it." And the teacher thought, what in the world? What do you mean? Don't you see that? Where are you seeing that? And he pointed to the place where it says, Jesus says the greatest command is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second one is like it. It's bad hermeneutics, but it's great theology. Because there's something to be said about loving the Lord and like that you do. Now, I'm going to step on toes, and I'm stepping on mine as I do this. How many of you love everybody here? You're supposed to just raise your hand. You don't know what Jim, raise your hand. Okay. Raise your hand. Do you love each other? Do you love each other? Okay. Do you like everybody here? Because I think there's a way in which I can love a person when I don't necessarily really maybe like them. Jesus did teach love your enemies, didn't he? And he did teach love your neighbors, and maybe they're not likable. Now, we said this in a couple of weeks back, that your love for your neighbor, or we said this last week, your love for your neighbor is not conditional. Love them when they love you back. Love them if they're lovable. And the reason it's not conditional is because God's love to you is not conditional. Now, you noticed, didn't you? When you got your outline, it's front and back. I got to get going. Are you ready to go? Here we go. So, here we are. I want you to realize something. We love God first, right? We love God first. When you're looking at that review of just what I went through now, we love God first and we love others, right? We've got it. And after all, which is the greatest command? And Jesus gave the greatest, and then he gave another one too. So there's two. First, and the next one's like it, right? It's not like it. It's love your neighbor as yourself, in case you were lost in that. But let's take a closer look. Is there more here than just two things? So let's take a closer look at this. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. That's one. As a matter of fact, Jesus said it was the most important one, right? And here we are, the second one. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's two, isn't it? Isn't it? Or is it? That's three. If you hadn't figured it out, the qualifier for loving your neighbor is that you got to love yourself. I want you to see that again. Love your neighbor as what to yourself? As yourself. And what's implied, although not written here and not given as a command, just like other places where we might have examples where Jesus didn't necessarily command us to fast, but he does say in the Sermon on the Mount, when you fast, don't do it like them, but be like this, right? Remember that? He didn't command us to fast, but he expected us to. There were other things Jesus expected us to do, and I think this is one of them. So the title of the lesson for today is Love Yourself. And when you think about these two commands, you can't have the right approach to loving yourself without the first one, and you can't do the second one without the third one. It's the qualifier. I hope you see that. It quantifies or it qualifies that love. Because Jesus said, okay, love the Lord your God. And he gave 4 little breakdowns on that. And then he said, love your neighbor. But he gave a basis for it. The pattern, the baseline as to how you love your neighbor. Now, he told a story, didn't he, in the Gospels, the Good Samaritan? Remember that one? To answer the question, who is my neighbor? That's what that story was about, that parable. But the basis for the love, this is the teaching of Jesus on what you do with the neighbor. The parable was, who's the neighbor? And he says, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, let me ask you a question here, okay? Just look at me for a moment. How well can you effectively love your neighbor as Jesus said for you to do if you don't love yourself? And let me ask you this. Do you think there are some people that you might know in your life, at your workplace, or maybe in your family, maybe someone even perhaps at church, that you know they don't like themselves? I think it's unhealthy to not love yourself. I do believe God wants us to love ourselves and like it. You know, in the first century, this is not on the outline, I'll be real quick here with this one, but in the first century, there was a big problem, and most of Paul's letters dealt with this. A many good part of them did. How many of you have heard of the word problem, or the problem, or the word Gnostic, or Gnosticism? How many of you have heard of that as a belief? Do you realize that Paul wrote a lot of his letters dealing with people who were Gnostic? And what that meant was, gnosis is and that starts with the letter G, but it's silent. Gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. But Gnosticism was this belief system that there was nothing good inherently in you, that your flesh was sinful, and it led to extreme behaviors of self-mutilation and abasement of the physical body. And to not ever find a comfortable place, but to kind of beat your body. As a matter of fact, Paul did say, I beat my body, bring it into subjection. But that's not what he meant by that. He was talking about discipline. But some people, even today, are into beating their bodies up. And they have low value and personal awareness of well-being. Sometimes what we refer to as self-efficacy. Or self-esteem, maybe. But you've got to, if you're going to carry out the second command. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but here's the conflict. The theology about Scripture teachings when it comes to the topic of self is confusing. It is confusing when you look at Scriptures about self. Here, I'm going to talk about two hands right quick. On one hand, you've got this. Paul wrote in Romans 12:3, do not think of yourself more what? Highly than you ought, but rather with sober judgment in accordance with the faith that God has distributed to each of you. And then we have, just last week, a passage that I brought up that I said I don't like this verse, Philippians 2:3, which says this, do nothing out of what kind of ambition? Selfish ambition or vain conceit. And then Jesus taught that we should what? Deny ourselves in Matthew 16. And apparently, lovers of themselves are to be marked and avoided, according to Paul in 2 Timothy 3:2. Lovers of self. And what about the passage in Luke 14, verses 25 and following? And let's look at that one right quick. Luke 14, beginning in verse 25. Jesus makes some statements here that are probably the most difficult to understand. I'm not sure it was difficult for the early disciples to understand it. And the reason I'm saying that is because in the Greek language that they would be speaking in, although Jesus does speak in Aramaic, I'm pretty certain he knew Greek as well. But when you translate it into English, it doesn't quite get the right connotation in our language as it would for them. So when I say it was the most difficult thing to understand, I'm not talking about them, I'm talking about us. And it says, large crowds are traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, if anyone comes to me and does not what? Are you following? Does not what? Hate who? Father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters. Yes, even their own life. What was the word used? Hate. And who's he referring to? Mom, dad, wife, kids, me. I mean, how can you be more specific than that word? Hate. Now, we're going to come back to that in a minute. Therefore, loving yourself seems what? Contrary to Scripture, doesn't it? Why am I up here saying the sermon is love yourself when you think I don't think so, Lanny. I'd rather follow Jesus, and I hope you do. I'd rather follow Jesus than you. You know, this is one of those areas where I'm going to search the Scriptures, and I'm going to make sure I'm based on Scripture, not on you, just because the preacher said it doesn't make it true. And that is true, by the way. That is true. But let me give you the other hand. On the other hand, you were made in God's what? Image. And on the other hand, you were wonderfully made. That's what David said in Psalm 139. And the same passage where we will read, deny yourself, will also later say, what would a man give in exchange for his soul, implying that you have worth. When I said a moment ago of time and money, time is your most precious commodity, I meant between those two, but your most precious thing that you have is your soul, am I right? That's the thing that lives beyond the grave. That's you for eternity. And that's the most priceless possession you have. And our relationships, specifically with our husbands and wives' relationships, are dependent on the love we have for ourselves. Here's what Paul said. I'm going to summarize it. Ephesians 5. As Christ submits to the church, we submit to one another. Wives, submit to your husbands. He talked about husbands, prepare your wife as a glorious bride like Jesus does for his church. And he goes on with this analogy and describes a beautiful passage there. But then he makes this one little statement about loving your wife as yourself, because no man's ever hated his own body or hated himself. And what Paul is saying there is, you need to, if you have great concern for your needs and yourself, and you want fulfillment, and you've accepted yourself, and you're in love with yourself, then you express that with love to your wife. It's almost as if when Jesus says love your neighbor as yourself, Paul is saying love your wife as yourself, or wife, love your husbands as yourself. And furthermore, God loved us. Who? The world. He loved us. And what price did he pay for you? The greatest. John 3:16, right? And Peter says in 1 Peter 2:9, you are God's treasured possession. Now, with that framework, how do I reconcile the two hands? Well, I'm going to give you, if you flip the page over, you'll see on the second page, I'm going to give you some things to think about in this reconciliation of how do you reconcile the two hands. I'll go quick here. First, we need to have proper context. These verses that we just looked at a moment ago on the first hand we reviewed are sometimes taken out of context, and you could leave here today if I don't go on, and I hope nobody gets out of here, right, without hearing this explanation about this thing about whether you hate your mom or dad or not, okay? That's why we sent the kids upstairs first, right, before they hear this, right? You need to know that there's a context value, and sometimes the context will bear the meaning out more than if you just pick apart something, or if you don't understand some of the verbiage there and the things that get lost in translation, because they do, then you'll miss the point. And so, give you a couple examples in here. I did. We have in the Bible, very same book and same chapter, by the way, that says everybody ought to bear each other's burdens, and then in a few verses later it says everybody ought to bear their own burdens. And on the surface, it's an apparent contradiction. There are many, many other examples of that, but I won't have time today to go through them. But I want you to notice this about the Romans 12:3 passage. Now, this is just on your outline. I just have the verses that I rattled off to you when I went through the first hand a while ago, but you might make notes out to the side of this, or you'll see that you have blanks here. In the Romans 12:3 passage, Paul does not say, quit thinking of yourselves. What he does say toward the end of the verse is, think of yourselves with what kind of judgment? Sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. Some people will look at saying, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. How many of you know it's also dangerous? Don't think of yourself more less than you ought. That can also be equally dangerous. That I'm a nobody. I'm unworthy. Well, you are unworthy. But don't be like the Elijah that just gives up because you give up on yourself, or Jonah who gives up on himself when things don't go the way that he wanted. Don't be Jeremiah who wishes he'd never been born, or Job who felt cursed by God. It wasn't fit to live and yearned to die. You see, what this passage is really saying is that we think of ourselves in the framework of being a godly person, one who's putting God first and loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and putting others before yourself. Now, I know that sounds weird because the one is the prerequisite to the other, but the basic for the other is you have to have this in place first. Love God, that's first. Love neighbor, that's second, but kind of third, isn't it? Otherwise, you couldn't do that didn't sound good. You couldn't do the second one unless you're doing the one that he says it's based on. So really, it's love God. And that, by the way, is the only healthy self-love you can have is if God's first. Because it's the other one that's bad. That's the other one that's bad. Okay. When you think of Philippians 2:3, selfish ambition refers to motivation that drives you to do what you do. In reality, selfish ambition is the opposite of truly loving yourself, because selfish ambition is doing what you want. But don't you realize you're doing yourself a favor and really putting yourself first when you put him first? You ever wonder why Jesus said, whoever puts themselves first will be last, and the one who puts himself last will be first? Was Jesus telling us he doesn't want any of us to be first? No, he was telling us that he wanted us to be first, but he says, don't put yourself first to get first. Put yourself last to be first. Do you get that? Everybody say yeah. Okay, you got it. In the Matthew 16:24, Jesus is actually telling disciples how to find their lives. His point is, you got to start somewhere other than yourself. If you save your life, you'll lose it. But lose your life and you'll save it. In the end, ultimately, what's Jesus want for your life? Saved or lost? Saved. Right answer. I was hoping you'd say that one. But in order to do it, you got to what? Lay it down. Most people want to save their life, and what are they doing? They're putting number one first. Me. I'm going to save. I want the best of life. It's all about me. And Jesus says you're going to lose it. You really want to save it. You think you're saving it, but you're not. If you really want to save it, lay it down. And then we have this 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 2, the word Paul used here about lovers of self that are to be avoided and marked. The word there in the Greek's based on phileo, not the agape love that we're talking about in the Greatest Commands passage. When Jesus used the word love yourself, or love others, or your neighbor as yourself, he was using the form that comes off of the agape, unconditional, godly love. This other one was a phileo love, a human-based love. That's the lovers of self we are to mark and avoid. And then in this tough one of Luke 14, this tough one, the bottom line is you cannot follow me if I'm not above everyone else. That's the point. You cannot follow me if I'm not above everyone else. And so in context, Jesus is not teaching hatred for your parents. He is certainly not teaching hatred for a spouse or your kids. Hate was a bad translation. It means to love less than you love God. Because aren't we to honor our father and our mother? Right? Children, obey your parents, right? Now this is the part where I needed to bring the kids down, which they'll probably be coming down here in just a moment. So I got to hurry. That's the first thing, context. The second thing is we need an understanding of the depth of God's love for us. Now, we said this about last week. We can never properly get around to loving our neighbor the way we know we should until we understand the way God loved us. Remember, that was the prerequisite for that. And one of the things I mentioned last week, if you'll remember, is sometimes what's holding us up from loving our neighbor is the fact that we don't forgive them. And that's the roadblock. And so we talked about how we've got to get around to forgiving, because if you remember from last week, forgiving releases the hurt. Well, guess what? Then if you have trouble loving yourself, you know what one of the roadblocks is? What do you think it is? We don't forgive ourselves, but we live with guilt and shame. Did God destine you to live your life with guilt and shame? No, He didn't. He came to set the captives free. Amen? The tomb was found empty, the stones rolled away, because He does not want you to bear the burden of death. That's finality. He wants you to know, I'm the resurrection and the life. And finally, we need to know how to properly prioritize whom we love. It's God first. And love for self underneath the umbrella and pretenses of all that has to do with loving God and putting Jesus first, and then extending it to our neighbor. It's prioritizing whom we love. The challenge is this, very quick. Live faithfully. You'll do yourself a favor by taking care of yourself, knowing that I'm living faithful, believing in an almighty God, and that Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, and I'm Spirit-filled, and I'm living my life. This may have to do with church attendance, but it's not the totality. It doesn't define your spiritual life in its completeness, but certainly commitment to the body of Christ and serving and loving and showing words of kindness and doing acts of kindness. Are you getting it? Live faithfully. Love unconditionally. Love unconditionally. No matter what they said. The speaker yesterday, Chris McCurley, talked about a time he was in a restaurant, and a restaurant they loved in Abilene, Mexican food I think it was. But this particular night, service was really, really slow. They didn't get their orders right, and everything, it was just driving him nuts. 30 minutes had gone by, and everybody else, even that had been seated after them, already had their food, and they didn't have theirs. And the lady comes up finally after 3 or 4 times saying, I'll be right back, I'll be right back, I'll be right back. Finally came to the table and said, I want to apologize to you. I am so sorry about this service. This is only my second day, and we had 3 people called in sick today. I'm not sure what I'm doing. And he thought about just a few moments earlier about giving her a piece of his mind. And he was trying his best to keep his lid on his frustration and anger. And here's what she said next to him. And by the way, I watch you preach on TV. That's what he said. He said, I want to tell you, when I left that restaurant, I was so glad that I put myself last for the sake of the cross of Christ. How many of you have been in a restaurant, you've eavesdropped on conversations of people talking about their church? Or is it just me? You're not listening then. Because I'll hear people sometimes, I'll even say this to Alexa, shh, they're talking about their church. Then I'll hear them complain about the singing and the preaching, and the grape juice tastes terrible, and that the unleavened bread is a piece of styrofoam, which I agree with. And I'm just smiling, and then I turn, and it's one of my church members. People are listening to what you say about your church. We're a billboard. You are the letter that's read by people about your church, about your faith, about your Lord. And don't put the church before Christ. I'm not saying that. Christ comes first. Amen? Love unconditionally. Lead diligently. I don't have time to talk about this more, but lead diligently simply means this. Romans 12 talks about gifts, and if your gift is leading, do it diligently, and you're leading people to Christ with what you say, what you do. I can't preach a sermon. I can't teach a lesson. I can't even, read a Bible very clear. Whatever that is, your example will lead people and they'll see your light. Finally, this. Learn objectively. Keep an open mind. Now, Gail's going to sing a song. I'm thankful that you were here for the duration of this longer sermon. This has been a wake-up call. But I want to remind you, I hope you have developed a life plan that includes these principles and that you'll snap out of a self-driven world and get into God's. Remember we talked about prayer not too long ago, and I gave you the definition of prayer. It is the invitation for God to come into your world and the motivation for you to get in His. And we'll pray for you today if you need to change your priorities and put God first. Won't you come as we stand and sing?